All right, so what do you say we jump into today's episode, which will be the first to feature two different guests. So we'll see how that goes. But the topic I hope that you will all find interesting: the business of space. So we have two guests that come at this from very different angles, but it'll be great to get their perspectives on the evolution of the space economy, some of the challenges that we face, the opportunities that we face, and so forth. So with that, I'd like to introduce Jackie Wattles. Jackie is the space and science writer for CNN, and Raphael Roettgen, managing partner for E2MC Ventures, which is a space-focused early-stage venture capital firm. First and foremost, thank you both for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Awesome. Well, Jackie, I'm going to start with you. So first of all, how does it feel to be on the other side of questions this time?
Very strange, very, very bizarre. I'm sure that both of you could answer any of these questions as well as I could, but I'm really excited for the conversation.
Well, to that end, I was actually kind of going back and looking at some of the first correspondence that we had many, many moons ago. And here's actually an article that I found from 2019 that says SpaceX launches Nickelodeon slime and Adidas soccer ball into space, which, by the way, that was a very fun launch. But a lot has changed in terms of commercialization of space. Maybe describe how the space economy first looked when you were covering it in this sector, and maybe how you would describe it now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so my origin story covering space actually goes back even a little bit further. The first story I ever wrote about space for CNN was one of the failed attempts by SpaceX to land their Falcon 9 booster in 2015, and was also lucky enough to cover the one that did it. And I remember that feeling like a seismic shift. In sources I had interviewed before the SpaceX landed its booster were very doubtful it could ever happen. There were a lot of naysayers. So it felt very transformative, although, of course, it wasn't immediately felt. It took a lot of years to get public kind of sentiment comfortable with the idea of this kind of move fast and break things ethos that SpaceX carries with it into everything it does in terms of space hardware development. And yeah, the world has completely turned on its head over the past 10 years. It is a completely different outlook. As I'm sure Raphael will speak to later, there's an enormous growth in private sector investment in space, which was not the case before. This is an industry that historically has been led solely by government investment. And that's still very much the case in terms of who's leading investment, but things are definitely starting to change. There's a space economy now. There's a startup, 10 startups for every thought about the future in space. So it's a completely different world.
So we're going to get into maybe some of the startup stuff in just a second with Raphael, but also, you mentioned the booster landing. Maybe to me, that's kind of where I thought that things really started to have that dramatic shift. And since that time frame, though, are there any things that kind of surprise you with how quickly we've been able to change kind of the landscape of space?
Yeah, I saw that question, and I'm not saying this just because Project Kuiper is going to launch its first batch of satellites this evening, the day that we're taping this. But by far and away, what has surprised me most has been mega constellations, specifically Starlink. I think when it comes to that type of massive investment, upfront investment by a company, seeking to build something on such a grand scale. I mean, you're talking about blanketing the world in internet connectivity. And I remember in the years leading up to the first even deployment of those prototype satellites, everyone said, the phased array antennas weren't going to work, that technology was too complicated and expensive, that SpaceX would run out of money before it had a functional network that could get this satellite internet business working. And now you see them with, what is it, around 6,000 active satellites in orbit now by one recent count, and nearly 5 million customers around the world. And all of that seems to have taken place in the blink of an eye, whereas a lot of space projects, I feel like you're waiting and waiting until launch day and you're kind of on the edge of your seat, like, come on, let's do it. Starlink, I think, is one of those things that has just kind of happened, and just by sheer launch volume, appears to have exploded in the blink of an eye.
Well, we don't like to use the word exploding in that regard, but
It's the words. Yep.
yeah. But I will tell you, as someone that lives on Florida Space Coast, we are frequently and often interrupted by our friends over at SpaceX with a Starlink launch. So, indeed, it's quite a shift. Speaking of shifting, let's go to Raphael. You've had a unique career journey that led you to the space industry, and I encourage everyone to go and take a look at your bio. But can you maybe give our audience a quick background and what sparked your interest in space as an investment focus?
Yeah, so very shamefully and sadly, I'm not a rocket scientist or aero astro engineer. I'm actually I went to Wharton and then I went to Wall Street. So clearly at some point in time I realized that was not cool at all and I needed to do something else. I'm not kidding. But so I had this finance background on Wall Street as an investment banker and as a prop trader and hedge fund guy. And then quite accidentally, I had a project where I was financially analyzing SpaceX, which was really the first time I looked at space from a business perspective, not just watching a cool launch, but actually like, what's the business part of that? What are the numbers? And and I was shocked. I was blown away. I was like, wow, this is like an amazing business already. SpaceX. This is 2017 when I first looked at it. Um, I thought one should invest in SpaceX immediately, but I also started forming a thesis that SpaceX was really only just the beginning. It was just the enabler because it was doing quite a few things which are, I think, more known now. But let me tell you, back in 2017, weren't consensus opinion. Like bringing down the costs of accessing space, very important, right? But also increasing the frequency, the cadence of accessing space, right? Like right now, you can literally go to space, like to space with SpaceX on, every few months on their shared missions, right? On their ride shared missions. And then if you take an entire rocket, you can even go more frequently. So SpaceX is bringing the costs down, and they're helping make space more user-friendly and accessible to startups. And by the way, just to be fair, it's not only SpaceX anymore, right? Now there's also other companies. But those are the really important underlying trends, right? You make space much cheaper to access and to operate in, and you make it more user-friendly. And then that opens up the perspective, which got me really excited of like, wow, we are really at an inflection point where we could, for the first time in history, develop a very meaningful space economy. And I still think we're just at the very start of that, and I can expand why I believe that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that you're absolutely right. Where we're just kind of at the tip of the iceberg, hopefully, and that's why we have things like this space station, where we kind of look at it as this incubator in low Earth orbit to be able to take advantage of the resources, get as much knowledge as we can, and see how that can be imparted, across the board, whether that's in low Earth orbit and beyond. But in looking at your firm in particular, so E2MC, which stands for Earth to Mars Capital, which is very, very solid marketing. And it's one of the few firms that's dedicated to early space investments. So can you maybe talk, I mean, you mentioned 2017, but what's the vision for E2MC and maybe how that has evolved over time?
Yeah, so like you point out, the vision is almost in the name, right? It's Earth to Mars Capital. Like we really want to help bring humanity into space and finance every part that enables that. But there is steps to that, right? So right now we are focused mostly the stuff. If you look at the stuff we're investing in, it's mostly stuff in Earth orbits, right? So it's traditional applications like satellite communications or remote sensing, but it's also more futuristic sounding up and coming stuff like in-space manufacturing, which I hope we'll talk a little bit more about.
Yep.
Then, I think there is going to be very soon a second phase, and that's going to be, well, exactly that, like the in-space manufacturing, but also then moving beyond the Earth orbits to things on the moon, various business models on the moon, and then ultimately, still longer out, actually stuff on Mars, right? Like what do we need to invest in so we enable like a human presence on Mars? Now, it's not entirely chronological. Like we can actually, and we have invested in things which would enable life on Mars already. But for us to invest at the moment, it can't only be applicable on Mars. It's probably some technology which also has use on Earth. So you can actually make money on Earth while you're waiting for the settlement of Mars to occur. So we see this like really, really like multi-stage development of the space economy. And that's really exciting because I think this could go on for a very, very long time. And I have this sort of megalomaniac sounding vision that if I do my job, E2MC could persist as a firm for a very long time frame. It's actually part of our values that we say we have a very long perspective. Like in an ideal world, we'll persist and be around as long as some of the ancient universities, or if you want to take the sci-fi comparison, will be something like The Foundation. If you read the book, the famous Isaac Asimov book, that's like really an organization which sticks around and helps to develop the human presence in space for maybe hundreds of years.
So, Jackie, I'm kind of want to build on what Raphael said and maybe get your perspective on this, especially, over the years, there's been a lot of media coverage on the amount of private investment that's flowing into space startups. And, as a business journalist covering space, are there maybe companies or sectors that maybe either pique your interest or more importantly, pique your editor's interest?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's no shortage of things to be fascinated by. Uh, I think when it comes to like evaluating what stories are interesting to tell about the new space sector, a lot of it comes down to discerning what's hype and bluster and what really is a very sustainable idea that could eventually either make an impact or give a return on investment. I mean, as Raphael pointed out, these are very long-term investments. You are not going to get an automatic return for your money. This is not the type of industry where that quick turnaround happens, not always at least. So yeah, I mean, the sectors that are really interesting to us right now are all of those sectors that are getting that type of investment, whether that's Earth observation has been a huge growth sector, and there's applications for that are incredibly wide ranging, from tracking production and manufacturing to global shipping routes, monitoring crop growth, all sorts of applications for that. Then you have in-space servicing. For example, Blue Origin just launched its orbital New Glenn rocket earlier this year for the first time. On board it was a test payload for a satellite servicing a structure called Blue Ring, which would kind of work as like an orbit in space, an Uber ride in space, where a satellite company could call up Blue Origin and say, I want to move my satellite to a higher orbit, or I need this type of servicing. Blue Ring could possibly address applications such as that. They're far from the only one. In space servicing as a huge sector, but that's just an example. So yeah, all of those are extremely fascinating business cases. But we also love to serve our audience interests, and I don't think that humans we're so primed to be fascinated with envisioning ourselves in space and learning about where the future will go. So as Raphael pointed out, his entire investment strategy is around this idea that eventually we can parlay different technologies that can be used for lunar exploration into a sustaining colony of humans on Mars. And if that is the eventuality, what does that look like? Where does the money come from? Who puts the money up, and what return on investment is there? I remember doing a whole story a few years ago about potential return on investment for colonizing Mars. And I even interviewed the Michael Meyer, who was the head of NASA's Mars exploration program at the time, and he said, there's a lot of Mars is exactly like Earth, and that's why there's not a lot of resources that can be mined that can give you a big ROI. So maybe the potential there is in these other types of technologies, is in learning what we don't know yet and finding new ways to capitalize on a future that's out in Mars. So yeah, hope that answers your question.
It does, and now it makes me kind of want to ask both of you a question, and then we'll use that as kind of a segue going into the break. So, we're talking a little bit about Mars and Moon and lunar. But if I wanted to be selfish and maybe look at the space station right now, are there certain technologies that either one of you are seeing that stand out and maybe have that potential for staying power that go beyond this space station?
Sure, I can go ahead and start. And I just want to quickly check. Do you mean like research projects on the space station, or do you mean more
Research
like?
projects, business ideas. I mean, you're kind of across the board. I mean, I think that's,
Sure.
the world is your oyster.
Great. Yeah, well, I mean, my first thought when you brought this up was pharmaceuticals, because that
Yeah.
is, I think, so often what is pointed to when you talk about what humanity is benefiting from work on the ISS. So there's been so much biopharmaceutical research, case in point being Keytruda. I just wrote a little bit about that in some previous coverage. They found a way to essentially create crystals that are the basis for a certain active ingredient inside this drug that look much different than how the crystals form here on Earth. And that essentially allowed Merck, which is the company behind Keytruda, to develop a drug that can be administered by a shot rather than this time-consuming intravenous injection. And that's not currently on the market, but it's types of applications like that I think show real promise. And there are a lot of companies out there too that are thinking further in the future and how we can continue that even after the ISS retires. I was just catching up with Vast. They plan to have pharmaceutical research on their private space station. There's a company called Varda that is trying to send their own capsules that kind of house just biopharmaceutical manufacturing labs that then come back on their own autonomously. So I think that's one area that's completely rife for transformation and has real world applications as well.
And Raphael, before I kick it over to you, I will say that I want to say in all three of the episodes we've done, we've now talked about Keytruda in some way, shape, form, or fashion. Because
Really?
when we were chatting with Johnny Kim, who's now on station, one of the things he was talking about was the excitement building around pharmaceuticals, and he used Keytruda as one of those examples. So again, Raphael, I'll leave it to you, and then we'll go run away to break.
Yeah, I will actually pick up on that. So what the space station enables, it's basically a lab that takes advantage of the special conditions of space, right? And so the most important one by far, I think, is microgravity, right? And just for completeness, there's also the fact that you're in a hard vacuum, and then there's also a special radiation environment. And the latter two are interesting for some things as well. But microgravity, if you think about it, it's mind-blowing. It's probably the most important, the most pervasive environmental condition there is. Like, all of us are like prisoners to it from the moment we were born and until we die, and except for like a few astronauts which occasionally escape from it. But it's the one environmental variable which scientifically we have least experimented with. Like, there is so much we don't know. Like, on the ISS, I think we've conducted something like 3,000 and a few hundred experiments. If you look at the biology
4,000.
part, sorry?
4,000 now.
4,000. There you go. Well, it's still not a lot, right? And I think if you look at the biology part, I think it's about 800 or so. Seven
Yeah.
or 800 experiments. Like, it's nothing. It's really, and even in this 7 or 800, we've already discovered really meaningful things, like the Keytruda example, right? But there is so many other examples of like bio use cases already, right? So we actually, E2MC, myself, we helped to start a company that's growing human tissue models, like three-dimensional tissue models called organoids in microgravity, and those have advantages over the organoids you can grow on Earth. They can be used in drug testing, they can be used in regenerative medicine, and so forth. There's companies who are working on better cancer therapies, including like personalized chemical treatments in microgravity. There's companies which work on better drug delivery mechanisms using nanoparticles in microgravity. There's companies that work on other types of protein crystallizations besides Keytruda. Keytruda is not the only drug to which this is applicable. So there's so many things. The potential is so big, but we have only just scratched the surface. And by the way, one thing we maybe should talk about, and I'm so happy, and this is the reason why I'm here on this podcast, and I'm so happy that Jackie is here representing a very big mainstream media outlet, is that most people beyond the space sector have no idea that this is happening. And critically, the people that you would need to have an idea, if I stick with biology for a moment, would be the people from the life sciences sector, right? People who work in pharma and biotech companies. The vast majority of them have no idea what's possible in space, and they think it's ridiculously difficult and ridiculously expensive to access. And when you tell them, look, you can fly an experiment for like a few hundred, like a small experiment for a few $100,000 to the ISS, they're like, oh my God, I thought it was tens of millions. Like, no, it's not tens of millions, it's a few $100,000. And so actually, because I see this big need for education, last week, myself, E2MC, and another space we see called Aurelia Foundry, my friend Ariel Aglaw, we co-organized a mini conference at MIT Media Lab. It was one afternoon just for the Boston Cambridge life sciences community, explaining what space can do for you for life sciences, why it's important, how you can access it in practice, and also a little bit how you can fund it. So we had about 50 people from the local life sciences community. It was actually more than I thought, so I'm very happy about this. And sort of the consensus opinion during the reception of people coming up to me was something like, oh my God, my mind is completely blown. I had no idea this is happening. I had no idea this is possible. We have to go back and discuss that internally with management. And so there is so much to come. The potential is so huge, but we have to, we're just scratching the surface, and we have to keep doing things like we're doing today to get the message out.
Well, I mean, I think that to your point, most people are really shocked when they realize that, ride up, the ride down, the astronaut supporting your investigation, that is assumed by NASA. Those are costs that are not passed over to you, the researcher. And so the idea of being able to take something from, if you live in a 3D environment and now you're able to send it to this fourth dimension or something like that, would you take advantage of that? And almost all of them would say, absolutely, we would if we knew that cost was not going to be a main barrier for that. All right, Raphael, where do you see the biggest near-term commercial opportunities in space? And are some of those maybe untapped or undervalued? And then lastly, are there any funding mechanisms in play that the startup community should be aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess picking up on some of the things I already mentioned, clearly I think in-space manufacturing is going to be a huge thing, right? And when I say in-space manufacturing, I have to clarify. So there's actually you can broadly divide into two categories, right? There's in-space manufacturing for use in space. That's also interesting, but that's less what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about manufacturing stuff in space, taking advantage of the special conditions, and principally microgravity, to bring it back to Earth, to use on Earth, and to serve huge customer sectors like the pharma industry, which is obviously a huge, huge multi-trillion-dollar industry on Earth with those products like Jackie mentioned better protein crystals. I mentioned organoids, these three-dimensional cell models. I mentioned like better drug delivery mechanisms and so forth. So again, I think we're only just scratching the surface there, but the potential is very, very big. So I think we will have significant companies which will take commercial advantage of that and will take advantage of the fact, what I mentioned at the beginning, that this is now actually also feasible in the sense that the costs of going to space and coming back, obviously, because you have to bring the products back to Earth, is finally cheap enough. So that's a difference, obviously, from what it was historically. And that that you'll be able to scale as well. That's also very important, right? That you don't only do this in very small volumes, but you can scale up. And there it's going to be very important that we have not only the ISS, but in the future, probably multiple stations and also multiple what we call free flyers, like capsules and vehicles like that, who can serve as platforms for production in space. And then the products were brought back to Earth on a regular basis. So the scaling up will also be possible. So we're very, very keen on in-space manufacturing. That's why recently we helped start what's called the Orbital Edge Accelerator in partnership with ISS National Lab and two other investment firms, Siri and Stellar Ventures. And that will enable startups to do this, and they can apply to the Orbital Edge Accelerator. And if they're accepted, they will get up to $500,000 of VC funding, venture funding, equity funding, but also, if all goes well, a sponsored free flight to the ISS. So for that specific thing we're excited about in-space manufacturing, that is, I think, a very, very interesting mechanism for the startups. Then there's also some other things I'm excited about, like the Golden Dome, sort of the DoD type stuff, but let's leave it here for the moment.
So you talked about Orbital Edge Accelerator. Can you maybe talk a little bit about how this is different, though, than maybe other investment opportunities for startups in the space realm?
I guess you mean other funding opportunities, like where
It is like, is there what makes this one stand out a little bit? And I think maybe the portion that you mentioned at the end was, the opportunity to have an investigation fly to the space station. That's probably something that's a little bit different. But is there anything outside of that that you would say is a little novel?
Yeah, I think it's at least a couple of things. It's what you mentioned. It's the fact that if all goes well and you tick the right technical boxes, you will get that free sponsored flight to the ISS, which depending on your needs, what you need to fly, I mean, that can be, let's call it an in-kind value of literally millions of dollars. So that's really quite significant for startups, right, which typically don't have that much cash. Plus, you get that venture funding from the three investment firms of $500,000 on top of that. But the other thing I think is important, this is a highly specialized accelerator, right? I mean, there's obviously many accelerators out there, but most of them are very generalist. And they're like, yeah, we help you with like a business plan, how to do the pitch deck, to connect you to some investors. And that's fine. There's some really good ones for that, but this is really highly specialized. Your company, you think you can leverage the ISS and or other space stations in the future, like this is the place to go because you will get a specialist community of people, of mentors who are excited about this and who can help you in practice with that, acting within a curriculum that's also designed to specifically help startups like that. So a very, very specific place to go to for startups which want to do something exciting in that specific subsector.
Well, I've had the privilege of obviously working with you along with some of the other investment teams, and you're absolutely right. The level of enthusiasm that they all have to see this through has certainly been one where it's inspiring for me because you're opening up access and opportunity in ways, and hopefully opening up the eyes of some of these companies that didn't realize that this was available. So again, excited to learn more about that and some of the companies that can be involved in the future. Jackie, shifting over to you, for, looking also at startups, maybe the rise of small startups versus more recognizable legacy companies. I mean, I think early on we were talking about there's Adidas and there's the Nickelodeons of the world, but we are seeing more and more of these small startups being able to access space. And maybe from your perspective, how that has helped to shape the narrative around space business.
Sure. Well, it certainly shaped the public perception of space. I think when you use a word like legacy, it tends to conjure thoughts of, legacy government providers such as Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, Boeing. And they're always sort of positioned as counter to this new age of space startup, which of course began with the SpaceXs of the world. SpaceX and Blue Origin were both founded in the very early 2000s and have both have grown into massive companies that I don't think can any longer be considered startups, but certainly in the public imagination, I think new space as a term kind of conjures images of a new responsiveness, of a renewed kind of excitement to explore these very big, grand visions of where humanity should be. So it's kind of less about, ticking through line items and to-do lists and being very responsive to the demands of Congress and certain presidential administrations, and more about kind of developing technology for the sake of it. When the private sector is, doing much of the investment, you can kind of pursue things that aren't necessarily a political priority. So I think in that sense, it definitely alters the landscape. But as I mentioned earlier, and I feel like I need to keep highlighting this, the government is still the primary funder of space activity because it just is so enormously capital intensive. But what organizations like Raphael's firm does is really find and bolster those technologies that can be swept under the rug that aren't necessarily a top priority for NASA's goals or DoD's goals, but could be an exciting application for a future in which we live and work in space.
To that end, as I'm thinking about some of the startups that we have had the chance to work with who have, grown leaps and bounds, and one of those examples I would say would probably be like a Redwire Space. And in knowing that they started from, a variety of companies who have now come under this umbrella, but they have gone from kind of niche in some of the areas they're focused on to truly serious space contenders kind of across the board. With that as maybe an example, what do you think has changed or is maybe driving that shift from some of these smaller startups to now becoming serious contenders?
Driving the shift, that's like making these companies grow.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, there is the one huge X factor between now and 10 years ago, and that is the availability of the Falcon 9 rocket. I mean, SpaceX has made like a 5x reduction in cost per kilogram of getting something to space. I think it's somewhere around there. Don't quote me on that. But the cost savings have been significant, and so that access to space, kind of provides new opportunities for people to go and try things, whereas beforehand it might have been too capital intensive to even attempt. So what we've seen is kind of industries build up around that and kind of provide new services. But yeah, the example like Redwire is a great case in point for how companies have kind of responded to modern demands too when it comes to in-space manufacturing and other applications. Like they can kind of see where a need is and coalesce parts of their business around it to meet that need.
And Raphael, so obviously we're talking about orbital edge and being able to leverage the space station. Right now we have this space station running through 2030. What do you foresee the startup community looks like in space? How is that going to evolve or look in the next 5 years? Do you think that, it's going to just continue to expand, or, are there some challenges that we face?
Well, I'll tell you what I would like it to be, and I think we're slowly getting there. So I want it to be a startup community that is where the founders and also the other stakeholders are coming not only from the space sector, but from many other places, from many other sectors. Because if we want to do what we were mentioning before, like, really exploit or grow these, for example, life sciences, biology use cases in space, so by the very definition, that can't be done by aero-astro engineers. And don't get me wrong, I love aero-astro engineers, right? But you really need the biology people for that too, right? And I have explained most of them are not aware yet of what's going on in space, right? So I hope that in 5 years, we will have brought in many more people who are currently not in the space sector, but are experts in fields where space can really make a difference, like the life sciences. And frankly, that's why I'm here today. That's why I'm having my own podcast. That's why I write books. That's why I do speeches, because I want to get this message out. Now, this isn't something that's, very abnormal. This happens in these big technological shifts. I'm sadly old enough to remember when the internet sort of took off in the late 90s. I was at college, and sort of the very first internet startups, it was basically the founders were all like the computer science nerds, right? They're from computer science departments. And then it took a few years until people outside of computer science understood the potential of the internet and came in and started using the internet to do really significant things. And then, of course, you fast forward a couple of decades and the internet is everywhere, right? The same thing happened with AI. Actually, my master's degree is in machine learning and AI, and I did that in 2013 to 15. And AI was basically just the computer science nerds. And then it took a few years, and now AI is suddenly everywhere. And I think with space, it's going to be the same thing. We'll need a few years for the message to get out, for space to be pervasive, but then it will be increasingly more and more in other places. And the space community will hopefully include many people who are not originally from the space community, but from other parts of the economy, but can use space.
And then I'm going to have one more question, then we get to go into the really fun rapid fire part of the day. But and this is going to be maybe for both of you, is in your mind, what's the biggest challenge that we have to ensuring a vibrant space economy, whether that be on this space station, LEO, or beyond?
I'll go
And
ahead
Raphael,
and
how about we start with you? Oh, never mind. No, Jackie can start now.
sorry. Yeah, so I wrote down two big things. The first being public perception, and the second being funding. I think anyone you talk to right now will say that the biggest uncertainty is what happens to the U.S. economy, the global economy in the coming years, because space is going to start to feel very secondary if we start to enter a very serious recession. And we've already seen there be a drawback in the amount of private sector investment. I think it peaked in 2021 and has almost halved since then. And I think that we'll continue to see some struggles in that area if the economy worsens. And certainly for existing aerospace companies, they're going to be worried about their supply chains and other broader economic factors. And to that same point, because so much of investment in space is reliant on the government, the public perception of space and how we see the importance of investing in space is going to be very important in terms of how the United States government continues to invest in space. If it starts to become extremely politically unpopular, if space is kind of always seen as the playground for billionaires, then we're going to have serious problems getting the public on board. So I think that's already something that decision makers and stakeholders are grappling with, and will certainly be something to contend with in the years to come.
Raphael?
Yeah, so for me, it's actually what I just mentioned before. It's the education of people outside of the space sector, but people that we need to join the space sector to make some of these things happen. I'm relatively less worried about, I've lived through the great financial crisis. Some of the most important startups that we have today were founded during the great financial crisis or shortly thereafter. There'll be capital around. There will be smart people who are anti-cyclical and provide capital. Also think on the government, So yes, I partly agree with Jackie, but I also want to turn it around a little bit. So space is rightfully seen as extremely strategic. So it's probably going to be one of the last areas that would experience cuts, right? And the other thing from a government perspective, which is important to realize, is that when I say space is strategic in the government's eyes, so when we're speaking about national security, sometimes people think of national security that's just like, weapons and missiles and stuff. It goes far beyond that. We're talking about like strategic sectors, can we secure our own semiconductor supply? Are we going to own like important cures like therapeutics that will be developed in the future? I mean, this is sort of the holistic vision the government, as far as I know, is rightfully taking. And that's all sort of in favor of it's going to play in favor of the space sector. And then I did briefly allude to the Golden Dome, and people don't realize the potential scope of this project. I mean, they don't, I think most people in the US don't realize it. And then if you go outside of the US, forget it. They really don't realize it. But this could be on the scale of almost a Manhattan project. I mean, you could be talking about like hundreds of billions of dollars, which effectively all will go into the space sector. Because the Golden Dome, simplistically speaking, half of it is basically space sensing, and half of it is space-based interceptors. So you have a potentially a massive influx of additional government capital into the space sector.
Awesome. Well, that's going to conclude the main questions of the day, but now we are going to hop into rapid fire. So again, rapid fire is designed to help our listeners to get to know you a little bit more and hope that you find it enjoyable at the same time. Okay, so Jackie, we're going to start with you. Now, who would you prefer? William Shatner's Captain Kirk or Chris Pine's Captain Kirk?
Oh, William Shatner.
Oh, the traditionalist. I like that. Raphael, what about you?
Yeah, William Shatner, hands down. I'm also like traditional. I will say that my favorite Star Trek series though is Deep Space Nine and Captain Sisko.
Very cool. Jackie, this one's also for you. Now, if you had the choice to watch either UConn's men's basketball team or women's basketball team, who's it going to be?
I'm sorry, who's women's basketball team or men's basketball
UConn's
team?
women, you're either your
UConn.
men's team or your women's team. If you had the chance to go watch one of those games, who would you rather go watch?
You're trying to get me in so much trouble, but it would be the women's team.
And for those of you unaware, Jackie was a loyal UConn alum, and she ran into me. I ran into her over at the Artemis II unveiling, and my beloved alma mater, San Diego State, was playing UConn in the men's national championship game. I don't want to talk about who won that game. I'm just going to move on. But okay, well, we've seen that you've made your decision.
I played volleyball at UConn as well. I was an athlete there. So it's
That's it.
the dedication is very much necessary. I hope you understand
Jocks abound. There we go.
about that.
Raphael, what are you reading right now?
I give you a couple of answers. I just finished the autobiography of Masayoshi Son of SoftBank, which is an absolutely amazing book, and it's sort of the guy's completely nuts, but it's sort of inspiring because he's taking such big bets. And actually, frankly, I wish we would have more people like that in the space sector. I mean, we do have Elon and obviously Jeff Bezos, but people who just take really, really ambitious bets. And the other one I do, which I also just finished, I always read several books in parallel. I have to give a shout out to your colleague at the ISS National Lab, Davide Marotta,
Oh
who's
yeah,
responsible for the biology stuff on the
yeah.
ISS National Lab. And he just wrote a very good, about 110-page primer on, it's called, I think, The Gravity of Innovation, specifically on biological research, a non-technical primer, biological research on the International Space Station. Anybody interested in the topic should definitely look it up.
It sounds like Jackie's got some book reading to do there. Let's see. So Raphael, sticking with you, which vehicle would you like to ride to the space station on? Would you rather do the Soyuz or Dragon?
Um, yeah, so leaving aside, I mean, geopolitics going on in Syria is obviously at the moment complicated. I would love to do both. I'll go with the Dragon just because, like, cool suits, more space, and all
All
of
the
that.
bells and whistles, right?
Yeah.
Jackie, I think that I see, like you were smiling, so I think that you're in accordance with that.
Yeah, I would take a ride on a SpaceX capsule, given the chance.
Yeah. Jackie, how many pitches a day do you get from PR people like me?
A lot. I don't think I've ever counted, but I routinely have several thousand emails per day. Um,
Yeah, it's to say that space has evolved rapidly, I think is I think we talked about how it's a very different ball game than it was 10 years ago. I remember when we didn't have 100 launches a year where, there'd be 8 to 10 launches a year. It was far easier to get a hold of you if that was the case. But you're a busy bee now.
if anyone is watching this that has sent me an email that I haven't responded to, I'd like to take this opportunity to apologize. I'm so sorry.
On behalf of most PR people, I will sit there and say, we accept your apology. What was your first job, Jackie?
My first job was I did a couple of internships out of college. I did an internship at the NPR station in Austin, Texas, KUT News. I worked for Morning Edition with Jennifer Staten there. And before that, I was an intern at a place called CT News Junkie at the Connecticut State Capitol. I did that while I was in college and cut my teeth on some political reporting. But I've worked with CNN now for 10 years. It's been the vast majority of my career.
Then Raphael, very last question. What about you? What was your first job?
I'm not sure whether you would have guessed that, but even though I grew up in Germany, very sort of American job, I actually worked at McDonald's. So, like people like even the president, occasionally work at McDonald's, as we know. And, frankly, I loved it, even though I can definitely not have any McDonald's anymore. I had enough for a lifetime.
I actually have a much better answer than I thought you meant, like in my respective field. But no, my first job was working at a place called Reunion Ranch. I grew up in Liberty Hill, Texas, which is a very rural suburb of Austin, at least it used to be. And there's a big sprawling ranch there where they would have like corporate gatherings, weddings, events, that kinds of thing. And I would help manage the grounds. And sometimes I would like lead kids around on little Shetland ponies. It was a very rural Texas sort of first job to have. It was a great time.
That is pretty cool. I didn't know that about you.
Fun
So
fact.
that is
Shout
a
out to
fun
Reunion
fact.
Ranch. Yeah.
Well, I think we're gonna leave that, leave the fun fact right there as the very last portion of today's conversation. Honestly, this has been a lot of fun from my perspective. I feel as though we could have talked for far longer, so I greatly appreciate both of yours ability to meet with us and join the podcast today and give your insights.
It was a pleasure, and thanks for doing that. I think it's great to have this new podcast to help get the important messages out we've been speaking about.
I appreciate that. And Raphael, real quick too, since we are doing shameless plugs, if people do want to learn more about the Orbital Edge Accelerator, where do they go?
There's a website you can look up. God, for memory, it's probably better if you put it in the show notes.
We'll put it in
case
the
I
show
mess
notes.
it up. But I think it's techconnect.orbitaledge.org or orbitaledge.techconnect.org. See, I
If
should
you
remember
look
this.
up Orbital Edge, I bet you're gonna find it. Awesome. Well, again, thank you both so much. Greatly appreciate you joining the podcast, and have a great day.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.